On this episode of China Uncensored, the Chinese regime is battling the U.S. for world domination, and now they're fighting a trade war. Hi, welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Since the 90s, the United States has been engaging with China more and more. Most favored nation status, normalized trade relations, entry into the World Trade Organization. Turns out, the Chinese Communist Party used that as an opening to hack U.S. intellectual property, give unfair advantages to Chinese businesses, and let's just say, there's hardly a World Trade Organization rule the Chinese regime hasn't violated. So, what can the U.S. do? President Trump, who had been tweeting about these trade issues even well before he was president, has doubled down on the trade war as a solution. But who's going to win? China or the U.S.? I sat down with China expert Gordon Chang to find out. Thank you for joining me today, Gordon.
Well, thanks so much, Chris.
So, the U.S. and China are in a trade war. Who's winning?
Well, it's a little bit early in a sense if we think about the tariffs of this year. But the Chinese have been waging a trade war against the United States for decades. And looked in that perspective, well, the Chinese are winning because they've been stealing, for instance, hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. intellectual property each year. And there have been so many other predatory tactics that they have used against America. Now, we're a big economy. We're a strong and robust economy. They're a fragile one. So in that sense, you could say, well, maybe we're still okay. But the point is, the Chinese have made big gains over the course of 2 decades. And so we've got to understand that perspective.
Well, I know my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, has written several articles about you, and they say you have a biased view towards China. Why are you so biased?
Well, I don't think that I'm biased. I think that I look at China realistically. You know, we have to understand what's going on in Beijing right now. You know, you've got Xi Jinping, a very aggressive, very provocative ruler. He wants China to be bigger than it is today. So, for instance, you have Chinese troops south of the line of the actual control in the Indian Himalayas. You have the Chinese trying to take the Senkaku Islands from the Japanese. The Chinese call them the Diaoyus. They believe the South China Sea is actually blue national soil, but everybody else thinks it's the global commons. You go through, there is a list of countries that are targets of the Chinese, and they're doing all sorts of other things. So, for instance, we see them lasering American planes, blinding American pilots. Well, if you blind the pilot of a plane, Chris, what you're trying to do is to bring it down. That is an attack on the United States. There have been a series of attacks on American planes and vessels, and we just sort of try to shrug it off. But China is very aggressive right now and very dangerous.
So there's an overall war, you might say, between China and the U.S., and the trade war is just an economic part of that.
Part of it, yes. I mean, China has really tried to make itself strong by building up its economy and by using the fruits of that to build up its military. So right now, China has the world's biggest navy. And that means that they are using it for purposes that its neighbors, the international community, the United States finds to be very destructive.
Well, so you've called the trade war an existential struggle for the Communist Party. What's at stake?
Well, what's at stake is really, you could say, the dominance of the 21st century. But the way I look at it is, the United States has an economy which is increasingly based on innovation. If we cannot commercialize the fruits of innovation, we don't have very much of an economy. So for us, it's really the future of the United States. You know, the economy has always been the foundation of American strength, and so clearly that's what's at stake. China doesn't want us to have that economy. So clearly we don't want to be in a quote unquote trade war with the Chinese. We want to get along with them. We've had a succession of US presidents who thought that the best interests of the Communist Party were in the best interests of the United States.
We should engage with China.
So this is really something which we don't want to do, but we've got our backs to the wall, so we really have no choice but to defend our economy.
And do you think a trade war is the best way to deal with the issues of intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, trade violations?
Well, we've tried to talk to the Chinese, to negotiate with them, to engage them, as you say. It just hasn't worked over the course of decades. So what we have to do is impose costs. People don't like tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs and Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. But the Chinese are not leaving us any choice. And if the tariffs don't work, Chris, we're going to have to probably go to trying to ban Chinese imports into the United States, things that are more drastic. So let's hope that tariffs work, but if not, we've got to be prepared to defend our society.
Okay. So what impact has the trade war up to now had on the Chinese economy?
We're at a really early stage of the tariffs where the United States has really started to impose costs. So there is some shaking of confidence, but it's really, I think it's not so much you can see it in GDP, gross domestic product numbers. You can't see it in ours. There's been a lot of moaning, of course, because people are worried about the cost of consumer goods. But the point is—
For the U.S.
For the U.S. But also you're going to see the same effects in China eventually. Right now we've imposed $50 billion of Section 301 tariffs on China. China's imposed $50 billion of tariffs on us. But last year we imported something like $505 billion worth of goods from China. So there's a lot more room for us to escalate this. And by the way, China, they're sort of run out of bullets in a sense because we only sold like $129 billion worth of stuff to them. So, when they get to $129 billion on tariffs on $129 billion of goods, we still got a lot more to go on them.
That's true. Well, what about some Chinese officials have said, we can just do business, we can trade more with Africa. We don't need the United States. Do you think that's a threat?
Long term, yeah, I suppose that's the case. If you look at Africa, it's sub-Saharan Africa, it's the fastest growing part of the world. But you got to remember that last year, China's overall merchandise trade surplus, 88.8% of that related to sales to the United States. So we now account for an outsized portion of China. I mean, they rely on selling things to the U.S. Decades down the road, can they lessen that dependence? Yes, they can. But you got to remember that other countries are going to take the same attitude that we've taken. So now you see a much tougher posture on the part of the Europeans, for instance. I'm sure that decades down, when Africa is really important to China, you're going to see the same thing. African nations are going to do the same thing we're doing because they, like us, are going to protect themselves.
And how does this right now impact the Chinese Communist Party?
There you're starting to see very interesting symptoms because, people in China are starting to understand that they cannot win a long-term struggle with the United States. And that's why Xi Jinping is trying to huff and puff and bluff us down. But I don't think President Trump is really going to back down in the face of that. But what people are saying in China is, first of all, well, look, we can't beat the Americans. So the question is, why are we taking them on? And Xi Jinping, I think, is coming in for a lot of criticism. There's been an erosion of his influence and position. We don't know how serious it is, but clearly it's been there because we're seeing people openly criticizing him. And we didn't see that 6 months or so ago. The point right now is that people are saying, like, who lost America? Because the United States, as we were talking about, really did see it as in its interest to help China. Now, Americans don't think that way, and we're seeing a hardening of attitudes, not only in the U.S., but also in places like Europe. And that is also critical because it means, for instance, that Beijing cannot play Brussels off against Washington.
In my view, the Chinese Communist Party has maintained its power by always saying that they can build a middle class, that they can keep the economy going and strong. If there is a risk to the Chinese economy, is that a risk to the Chinese Communist Party itself or Xi Jinping?
Of course, because the party has made it very clear, they've been explicit about this, that the Communist Party has a right to rule, not only because it represents the wave of proletarians and the rest of it, but in a practical sense, they say they have the right to rule because they've been able to develop the economy. They've been able to make China strong. When China gets shaken by President Trump, that's a problem for him. So for instance, we had this 7-year ban on ZTE Corp, the embattled Chinese telecom equipment maker. That was a death sentence. And what the Chinese officials said was, oh my gosh, the Americans are able to do this to us. And they started to blame us, of course, but also Xi Jinping for creating this problem. And so that's why I think that Xi Jinping, in order to regain the authority that he's lost, the position that he's lost, what he needs to do is he needs to, quote unquote, win the tariff battle with President Trump, which means that he's setting China into a very dangerous position because long term, their economy cannot stand up to ours. We got a much bigger economy. We got a more stable economy. We're growing faster than China is in reality. We don't have a critical systemic debt crisis on our doorstep. So, you know, China is just not in a position to wage this struggle, and yet Xi Jinping is absolutely determined to do so.
Well, speaking of Xi Jinping, and I'm in no way defending him, but these intellectual property theft, trade violations, like none of this started with him. That's been going on a long time. Is it an issue that like he might become the scapegoat for some of these long-term practices?
Well, he's going to become a scapegoat for a lot of things. And the reason is that throughout his 5.5 years in power, what he's done is he's purged a lot of people. They call it anti-corruption, but it's really a political purge. So he's created enemies. And those enemies have been intimidated by him, but recently they've been coming out and criticizing him in public, which is an indication that Xi Jinping's in a little bit of trouble. And so whatever the issue is, you know, it could be South China Sea, it could be Taiwan, whatever doesn't go right for Xi Jinping, his adversaries are going to use it. Because remember, he's made himself the chairman of everything. And that means when things go well for China, great for Xi Jinping politically. But when things don't go well, he does not have anybody else to blame. Because he said he's supposed to be in control, absolute control. That means he's absolutely responsible when things don't go the way the Chinese want them to.
Well, let's talk about Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025. How is this trade war going to affect that? Am I still going to be able to buy a Huawei phone with pre-installed spyware?
I don't think so, unless you go to China itself. You know, we've seen countries now start to say, look, we're not going to allow Huawei networks for 5G. 5G is the next generation of wireless communications. So you can't buy it in Australia. You probably will not be able to buy it in the United States as well. And I think other countries probably will follow suit. Made in China 2025, where they've designated 10 sectors to dominate, now 11 with the addition of 5G. That is just one big World Trade Organization violation because of its numerical targets for Chinese control of its own market. Complete on its face, it's just not going to pass WTO muster.
When has that stopped them before?
It hasn't stopped them before, but it is also now at the core of the U.S. complaints against China. You know, in the beginning, when we started this tariff struggle, you know, President Trump was saying, look, I'd be happy if you reduce the bilateral trade deficit by $200 billion. They're not talking about that anymore. They're talking about China's industrial policy, which is Made in China 2025. They're talking about subsidies for state-owned enterprises. They're talking about things that go to the core of the Communist Party's economy. And so Made in China 2025 is now a critical issue in the discussions between the U.S. and China when they occur. They're not occurring very often, by the way. But the point is that the U.S. has now decided to focus in on the critical issues, not just sort of the thing about trade deficits, which were superficial at best.
So this has expanded in scope. It's become more fundamental.
Absolutely more fundamental. That is the exact word for this. This has become structural, fundamental. We're not looking at things that are peripheral anymore. And that's a problem for China because Xi Jinping is, and a lot of other people are not in the mood to change Made in China 2025. They are willing to not talk about it. They try to downplay it in the media. But nonetheless, they're not giving up on it, which means that as long as President Trump is around, he's going to be banging on them in this. And I think it's even just more than Trump, because there's a bipartisan consensus now in the United States that something's got to be done about China.
Yeah, I remember even Chuck Schumer said he'd like to give Trump a pat on the back over the initial tariff.
Well, if you look at Congress, Trump's support on tariffs is found mainly in the Democratic Party. And there's a number of reasons for that. But everyone's coming along because, you know, yeah, people don't like tariffs. They moan about, complain about them. But the question is, what you're going to do about China's theft of U.S. intellectual property. This is an existential threat for the American economy, which means it's an existential threat for the country as a whole.
What are the possible risks for the U.S. economy? Like, how is this going to affect your average American?
I think that what we could see, for instance, consumer prices will go up on things, but you've got to remember, this is overblown. So for instance, take this mug. You know, a lot of them are made in China. So
Not that one.
Not this one, and I congratulate you for that.
Thank you.
But the point is, most mugs in the U.S. are made in China. Prices are going to go up on mugs at some point, but it really doesn't matter. And the reason is that mug manufacturers can easily move their supply chains out of China. And we're starting to see that already for a number of reasons, not only because China is no longer the low-cost manufacturer in the world, but also because companies are worried about the security of their supply chains because of the quote-unquote trade war. So you're seeing companies now actively take steps to move their supply chains out of the People's Republic. Also, there's one company that's going to have a really hard time, and that is Apple, because their supply chain is firmly fixed in China because of Foxconn, their contract manufacturer. But, you know, even Apple at some point will be able to move if it gets bad enough. And so, you know, the other effect is we won't be able to sell soybeans to China. Soybean farmers are sort of up in arms, but the point is there are only so many soybeans in the world at this particular moment, Chris. So if China doesn't buy U.S. soybeans, they got to buy them from basically Brazil. That means Brazil is not going to sell to its traditional customers, which means the U.S. is going to sell to Brazil's customers. And by the way, that tentative agreement that President Trump negotiated with the European Union, that is part of that deal is that Europe buys American soybeans. So soybean farmers are going to be hurt a little bit, but not too much. And by the way, a lot of people in Iowa, they're not going to be planting soybeans this year. They're going to be planting corn or other things.
With that high fructose corn syrup we all love.
Yes, and I got a sweet tooth. But the point is, what we're going to see is American farmers adjust. And yes, there will be problems to the U.S. economy, but you cannot have maintained decades of misguided trade policies and economic policies with China and expect we can get out of this without any cost. We're going to have to do this because the overriding reality is that China is harming our economy, and it's doing so in a malicious manner. We can compete anybody fairly, and if they compete fairly and they win, that's one thing, but that's not what's happening now, Chris. What we're seeing is China, one WTO violation after another, one violation of their bilateral agreements with us after another, and these are critical. They're not just superficial, unimportant violations. They go to the core of our trading relationship with China. We've got to do something. That's why this is not just a Trump issue. This is an American issue. Americans understand they need to protect their economy. I mean, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in the loss to American companies and workers. And so clearly this is unacceptable. We've accepted it for far too long, and basically Americans are saying now, no, we're not going to accept it. And that's why people may not like the tariffs under Section 301 of the Trade Act of '74, but the point is, what else are you going to do? And if those tariffs don't work, as I mentioned, we're going to have to do things which are even more drastic. But at the end of the day, we're going to make sure that we defend our economy.
So what's the end game?
I think the end game is a long struggle with a very willful Xi Jinping. But it's a struggle that we, as I mentioned, we don't want, but it's a struggle that we have no choice but to wage. So we will wage it. And I think that China, long term, as I mentioned, even the Chinese understand they cannot win that struggle with us.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Gordon. If somebody wants to learn more about you or read some of your work, where can they go?
I archive my pieces at my website, gordonchang.com, and on Twitter, Gordon G. Chang.
Great. Well, we'll put a link in the description below. And thank you again for joining us. That was very insightful.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you, Chris.
Absolutely. And enjoy the mug.
Thank you.
Want to hear more in-depth interviews about China? Check out our new podcast, China Unscripted. You can subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify, as well as YouTube. Subscribe now, or else communism wins.